Hey everyone, this is Stein, and this is the Chart of the Week series on the WR YouTube channel, where each week we look at your favorite Dynasty assets and talk about whether they should be buy, sells, or holds. And this week we're going to look at a cluster of wide receivers that are age 29 and older and score 20 fantasy points per game or greater. So we're talking about Tyreek Hill, Stefon Diggs, Kupp, and Davante Adams. And we're going to take a look at a bunch of charts and talk about what you should do with these wide receivers from a Dynasty fantasy perspective. Let's get to work. So hey again, guys, thanks so much for joining. This is going to be a little bit longer video because I'm going to go through my entire process here and we're going to look at a ton of charts. So let's dive right in. The first chart, this is KTC of those four wide receivers: Tyreek Hill, Stefon Diggs, Kupp, and Davante Adams. Again, KTC is KeepTradeCut. It's a site that uses crowdsourcing by asking people whether to keep, trade, or cut certain players, and they have an algorithm that comes up with values. It's basically a sentiment indicator. So this chart is their KTCs over the past 3 years since April 2020. And you can see at the start, you sort of have two batches. You have the Tyreek Hill and Davante Adams up at the top. Those guys are trading in the range of 8,000 to 9,000 KTC. And then you have Kupp and Stefon Diggs that are sort of grouped together. And those guys are trading in the 6,000 KTC range. But if you go all the way to the right-hand side of the chart, all these guys are sort of grouped there together very similarly at the right-hand side in that high 4,000s to mid 5,000s KTC range. So another thing I want to point out here, these purple bands are in season. So these are the fantasy football seasons, week 1 through 18 or week 1 through 17 for these players. And from left to right, the first purple band there that you see, that is when these guys are ages 26 and 27. This middle purple band, that's ages 27 and 28. And the third purple band, that's ages 28 and 29. That's how old these guys were out through these time periods. So I'll call your attention to a couple different points in this chart, right? So the first interesting point here is you can see in the Buffalo red, the Stefon Diggs in the first band. That is the year that Stefon Diggs moved from Minnesota to Buffalo. So the first year he's playing in Buffalo, playing with Josh Allen. And his KTC actually takes a tremendous leap in there up into the first sort of grouping there, going from the 5,000 KTs to the 7,000 KTCs very quickly, a very sharp increase in price for him. And then I'll draw your attention to the second band here, the middle band, where Kupp has a similar move. And that's the year he has that amazing fantasy points per game season, almost nearly 26 fantasy points per game, playing for the Rams that year. And he goes from KTC in the 4,000s and jumps up to around the 6,000s, also sort of catching up into the group of all four of them. So that was another tremendous increase in pricing as well. And then finally, in that third band, the big riser was the Tyreek Hill. So if you remember last offseason, it was the Chiefs to the Dolphins and sort of him sort of being left behind a little bit. But then he goes and has another good fantasy football season from a points per game perspective, and then it sort of takes off. And he's the one in that season that his KTC price had risen that season, and then also falls off. And they all sort of are grouped there to finish at the end. So one of the main things I wanted to talk about here in this chart of these wide receivers is the age cliff, right? So, and I think this is a good representation of what an age cliff is. And we're not talking about production here. The production for these wide receivers is 20 fantasy points per game or greater. These are elite producers at the wide receiver position. So production is not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is as you get to be older, say your 29th year, age 30, age 31, their dynasty values and their prices, their KTC prices will tend to fall, and they'll tend to fall rapidly. And the analogy I want to use here is like catching a falling knife. So when the knife falls off the counter, do you reach down and grab it and catch it on the way down? Or if you do that, you're probably going to feel some pain. It's probably going to get hurt. And that's sort of the analogy I want to make for, catching a wide receiver as he's, hitting that age cliff and his price is falling down. And the example I can use here is DeAndre Hopkins, right? So he's 31 years old now, and he went from 9,000 KTC to mid 6,000 KTCs, and now he's in the 3,000 KTCs. And he's 31. And all these guys are sort of in that 29, 30 year range. And they're in, we talked about this in the high fours to mid 5,000s. So eventually, I'm not saying it's a straight line, but eventually with the age, even though they're producing, the path is falling down. And generally the best thing, going back to the analogy, you don't catch the falling knife. You let the falling knife hit the ground, bounce around a little bit, come to a stop, and then you just pick up that knife. And that's sort of what you want to think about when you're thinking about these sort of wide receivers that are coming up to their age cliff. So let's take a look at each one of these charts individually. So first we're going to look at Tyreek Hill, right? And for those that have seen these videos before, we kind of know what the blue line is, their KTC over time. That matches the highlighter blue line that we saw, the Miami blue line that we saw in the previous chart. This is just his. And there's a bunch of studies on here, but what you want to pay attention to is this solid red line that kind of goes along with it. So you can see in this chart, Tyreek Hill falling from the 9,000 all the way to 5,000, and last year bouncing from 5,000 up to 6,000, but then coming back down. You can actually see his blue line crossed back through that solid red line, 150 days. So where there was hope to the upside, now it feels like a little bit of hope is gone. Now, if he goes and has another good performance, good season next year, I can see his Dynasty or his KTC price bouncing back up to those mid 6,000s that we saw at last year's prices. But I feel like that's sort of capped. That's sort of the upside. And actually, when we go through these valuations that we're going to see in a couple slides from now, you'll see that I actually think there's a little bit of downside in Tyreek Hill's price chart here. So the next one we're going to talk about here, the next one is Davante Adams. This is the perfect example of what catching a falling knife analogy means, right? So at any point in this chart, if you felt like Davante Adams was getting to be sort of a value, even though he's producing, we know he can produce. If you bought in, you lost value anywhere along this line. So that's what I mean sort of by catching the falling knife. He's on a path down. We got to wait for that knife to hit the floor, and then we can pick it up. And you don't want to be early, because at each point through this chart, you have lost value, dynasty value, if you're buying in. Now, that doesn't mean that he's bad, right? He's still going to produce fantasy points for you. But you have to be aware that you would be catching a falling knife. You would be losing dynasty trade value if you're buying in on Davante Adams. It doesn't mean he's bad. It doesn't mean he doesn't win you championships. But this is just how we're looking at what the age cliff looks like from a dynasty perspective. So next one here I'll show you is Stefon Diggs. Stefon Diggs, he's sort of like a year behind Tyreek Hill and Davante Adams, even though they're all very similar from an age perspective. But he did have that shoot up from the change in situation with the Dolphins and playing with Josh Allen. And so a lot of his price tends to be attached to playing with that awesome Josh Allen QB from that perspective. And he does have a bounce back up last year and comes back down. This chart isn't the worst. It does look a little undervalued right now, but you can see there's nothing like too inspiring. And when we're thinking about the age cliff, this is another one that we're kind of showing that same sort of thing. And then this is Cooper Kupp, finally Cooper Kupp. I actually did an entire one of these videos on Cooper Kupp himself, where I talked about Kupp being sort of this short-term buy. So, if you guys have seen this chart, we'll talk a little bit about it, but let's talk about how I came to that conclusion in the next chart and how we're valuing these players. So here's the chart, lots of arrows, lots of stuff going on. And let me try and walk you through it, right? So this is how I come up with whether I think player is overvalued or undervalued. It has to do with this comparable analysis. So comparing players that are of similar age, similar production, and similar potential. And the gist of it is, because they have similar age, production, potential, they should be valued similarly. So how am I thinking about value? Value is KTC divided by fantasy points per game. And the way that I would do that is I would call that the PE ratio. And just like you're valuing a company on the stock market, the PE ratio, price to earnings. We're doing that for fantasy football. So his price is his KTC and his earnings are his fantasy points per game on the field. How does he earn points for your team, right? So the first step here is the blue arrows. So we're taking the player's KTC, his current KTC, divided by his fantasy points per game projections. That's the JPPG line right there. And divided by 10, and you get the player's PE ratio in the next column. And then what you do is you take the average of all of those PE ratios, the 27, the 26, the 22, and the 24, average together equals 25. And that's that blue circle with the arrow pointing to the next line, next column. So that blue circle represents the average, the group average PE for all of these guys. So what we're going to do is we're going to use that group average PE, that 25, and sort of reverse out of the equation using the same estimates for fantasy points per game, but the new target multiple, the new target PE ratio. So those are the green arrows to give you a target KTC or target price for each one of these players, right? And price and value are not the same thing, right? So just because he's priced at this certain KTC doesn't mean what his value is. What we're doing with this target KTC is that's what we're coming up with as fundamental values. So the yellow arrows, his KTC, what it is currently, versus his target KTC, gives you an upside and downside of what you can expect, and overvalued or undervalued from that perspective. So I do that for everybody. This is a tiny little sliver of the market, right? We're just comparing these four players to each other, and that's how we're coming up with a valuation because we think they should all be valued similarly. So using that, you can see that Cooper Kupp looks like he's 11% undervalued, or there's 11% upside to his KTC, and Tyreek Hill looks like he is 9% overvalued. That's what that column sort of means, that last column in the chart. So if you wanted to, you can try and capture some of this inefficiency, this arbitrage in the market by trading Tyreek Hill for Cooper Kupp plus more. And you're not losing too much on age. You're not losing anything on production. And you're collecting plus more. And you're capturing this arbitrage in this tiny little section of the market. But the bigger story is, and I'm going to go back to this first chart here, and the overall theme we're talking about here is as these wide receivers are getting older and approaching their age cliff versus how much they produce on the field, you get a sense of that catching the falling knife thing that we were talking about before, where they're sort of on this downward trend, and anytime you're going to step in, you're going to be catching a falling knife. You got to wait for it to hit the ground, bounce around a little bit, and then you can pick it up. So I do think it makes sense that you can make a swap within the cluster to kind of capture some of this value arbitrage that you have, but I would not recommend using real Dynasty youth value to get into this cluster. It's probably just better to wait for these guys to fall, hit the floor, and then pick them up when they're cheap. So don't get me wrong. These guys are very good. They will score you tons of points. But from a Dynasty perspective, the age cliff is on the horizon, and it's okay that these guys, their value falls as long as they're helping you win at fantasy championships. But you just have to be aware of the path that we were on in this age cliff. And to me, definitely looks like there's a little short-term value arbitrage that you can have if you want to hold Kupp versus holding the others. But it's not so much about there being this huge true upside here. It's more about him just sort of being cheaper given how many fantasy points he scores and not having to fall as much as the others. So that's it. I really hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much for watching. Let me know who you want to see again next week. We actually have DJ Moore and Mike Evans up coming soon. So please like, comment, and subscribe down below. And if you're not already, join up in the WR Patreon. We'd really appreciate it. There's a lot of smart people in there and learn a lot. You can find me on Twitter at _Jason Stein. And we'll have the new Dynasty stock market series up on the Fantasy Football Guys here coming at the end of March. So looking forward to that. Thanks so much for watching, and see you again next week.